Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
Nobody talks about this part. Everybody talks about what happens when a woman chases, explains, reaches out, tries harder. But there's a different version of her that quietly changes everything. The version that stops. Not because she stopped caring. Not because she stopped feeling, but because she got tired of carrying the entire emotional weight of the connection by herself. And strangely, that's usually when he starts feeling her the most. Not when she's texting. Not when she's reassuring. Not when she's trying to fix what's broken. When she's gone quiet. When her attention is no longer available on demand. When her energy is no longer reaching for him. I've watched this happen. I've lived it from both sides in different ways. And the uncomfortable truth is that what feels dangerous isn't her absence. It's what her absence forces him to sit with. The thoughts he could avoid when she was still there. The feelings he could postpone. The reality he kept pushing into tomorrow. Because sometimes a man says he needs space, and then discovers the silence is much louder than the relationship ever was. I don't think most people realize when it starts happening. Not because they're careless. Not because they're cruel. Just because human beings adapt to almost everything. We adapt to good things. We adapt to comfort. We adapt to someone being there. And sometimes, that's exactly the problem. I remember hearing someone say once that you never notice the sound of your refrigerator until it stops. And for some reason that always stayed with me. Because relationships can become like that. Not cold. Not mechanical. Just familiar. So familiar that the very thing holding parts of your life together becomes background noise. You stop noticing what it's doing because it's always there. Her messages. Her attention. Her emotional consistency. The way she remembers things you forgot. The way she notices when something feels off before you've even admitted it to yourself. The way she asks if you're okay and somehow already knows you're going to say, "I'm fine." After a while, those things stop feeling extraordinary. They start feeling normal. Expected. And that's where something dangerous quietly begins. Not dangerous in a dramatic way. Not betrayal. Not heartbreak. Just the slow human tendency to stop seeing what never leaves. I've done this before. I'm not proud of it. I remember a period in my life when there was someone who always checked in. Not obsessively. Not in a needy way. Just consistently. If I had a difficult day, she'd somehow know. If I disappeared into my own head for a week, she'd still send something small. A funny photo. A random observation. A voice note talking about something completely unimportant. At the time, I appreciated it. At least I thought I did. But appreciation and awareness aren't always the same thing. You can appreciate someone while still failing to fully see them. And that's a hard thing to admit. Because nobody likes thinking of themselves as the person who took someone for granted. But sometimes that's exactly what happened. Not intentionally. Just gradually. I think that's what makes it so difficult to recognize. There's rarely a moment where someone decides, "I'm going to stop valuing this person." It happens much quieter than that. You get busy. You get stressed. You get distracted. Life becomes loud. And meanwhile, she's still there. Still showing up. Still caring. Still reaching. So your mind starts categorizing her presence as permanent. Which is ironic. Because nothing is permanent. But emotionally, that's what happens. We begin acting as if certain people will always be there tomorrow. And tomorrow. And tomorrow. And tomorrow. Until one day they aren't showing up the same way anymore. And suddenly the absence is louder than the presence ever was. I remember one specific night. Nothing major happened. No fight. No dramatic ending. No emotional explosion. That's what's strange. The moments that change things are often incredibly boring. I was sitting in my apartment after work. The television was on. I wasn't really watching it. My phone was next to me on the couch. And somewhere in the middle of scrolling through absolutely nothing important, I realized something. She hadn't texted me that day. Now, logically, that shouldn't have mattered. People get busy. People have lives. One day means nothing. But my body noticed before my mind did. That's the weird part. I kept picking up my phone, unlocking it, locking it again, checking notifications, putting it down. 5 minutes later, doing the same thing. I wasn't even conscious of why. At least not yet. Then eventually the thought arrived. A little late. A little awkward. A little embarrassing. That's it. Just. Because some part of me had apparently expected her presence without realizing it. Expected the check-in. Expected the message. Expected the attention. Not because I demanded it. Not because I felt entitled to it. Just because it had become part of the emotional furniture of my life. And furniture is invisible until somebody removes it. That's the part people rarely talk about. Sometimes the realization doesn't arrive as heartbreak. Sometimes it arrives as confusion. A strange feeling that something is missing but you can't immediately identify what. Like walking into a room and knowing something feels different. You stand there for a second, looking around, trying to figure it out. Then suddenly you notice. The painting is gone. The lamp is gone. Something familiar disappeared. And your nervous system recognized it before your conscious mind did. I've seen this happen with men over and over again. And honestly, I've seen it happen with women too. This isn't really about gender. It's about human nature. The person who keeps showing up often becomes invisible first. Not because they're unimportant, because they're reliable. Which sounds unfair. Because it is. Reliability creates comfort. Comfort creates familiarity. Familiarity creates blindness. And blindness creates regret. Usually much later. Long after the moment itself. Sometimes months later. Sometimes years. What's especially uncomfortable is that a person can genuinely care about someone while still overlooking them. Those two things can exist together. That's the contradiction nobody wants to admit. You can miss someone while ignoring them. You can value someone while failing to prioritize them. You can love aspects of a person and still behave as though they'll always be available. Human beings are full of contradictions like that. I know I was. There were moments when I absolutely cared. Moments when I thought about her. Moments when seeing her name appear on my phone made me smile. But there were also moments when I delayed responding because I assumed she'd understand. Moments when I got emotionally lazy. Moments when I thought, I'll call tomorrow. I'll explain later. I'll make time next week. And sometimes next week never comes. That's the frightening thing about emotional availability. You don't notice its value while it's consistently accessible. You notice its value when access changes. When the pattern breaks. When the expected signal doesn't arrive. And suddenly your brain starts reviewing evidence it ignored before. The messages. The effort. The patience. The emotional labor. The countless small moments that felt ordinary because they happened every day. There's a particular kind of silence that appears when this happens. Not dramatic silence. Not punishment. Not manipulation. Just absence. Pure absence. And absence has a strange way of revealing things. Things you weren't looking at. Things you postponed. Things you assumed would always be waiting for you. I think that's why her energy feels different when she pulls back. Not because she becomes somebody else. Not because she suddenly gains magical power. Not because she transforms overnight. Most of the time, she's simply taking her energy back. The energy she was already giving. The energy you stopped noticing. The energy that quietly became part of your emotional environment. And now it's gone. Or maybe not gone. Just no longer reaching toward you. And that's when something uncomfortable happens. For the first time in a long time. You actually see it. You see what was there. You see what it was doing. You see how often it carried emotional weight you never acknowledged. And maybe the hardest part is realizing she didn't suddenly become valuable. She was valuable the entire time. You just got used to her being there. And that's a truth that lands with a particular kind of heaviness. Not dramatic grief. Not immediate heartbreak. Just a slow realization. The kind that arrives when you're driving home at night. The kind that appears while staring at a red traffic light. The kind that shows up when you're reaching for your phone without thinking. The kind that quietly whispers. You thought she'd always be there. And maybe, without realizing it, you started building parts of your life around that assumption. The thing nobody tells you is that panic doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it doesn't look emotional at all. Sometimes it looks productive. Busy. Distracted. Irritated. Sometimes it looks like a man saying he's completely fine while his entire routine quietly starts changing around a feeling he refuses to name. And I know that sounds dramatic, but honestly, it's usually much less dramatic than people imagine. It's subtle. That's what makes it dangerous. Because if someone starts crying every night, at least they know something is wrong. But what happens when the feeling never arrives as sadness? What happens when it arrives as restlessness? As impatience? As a strange inability to focus? As opening the refrigerator 4 times in an hour, even though you're not hungry? As scrolling for 2 straight hours and somehow feeling more exhausted afterward? Those things don't immediately register as emotional experiences. They just feel annoying, random, disconnected, until eventually you realize they aren't disconnected at all. I remember a period when somebody started pulling back from me. At least that's how it felt. Maybe she was simply matching my energy. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she was protecting herself. To be honest, I still don't know. And that's part of the story too. Sometimes we never get perfect explanations. Sometimes all we get are changes in behavior. The replies become shorter. The conversations become less frequent. The emotional warmth isn't gone. But it's no longer overflowing into your life the way it used to. And at first I told myself I didn't care. I really believed that. I had 100 logical explanations ready. She's busy. Life happens. People have responsibilities. Don't overthink it. And intellectually, all of those explanations were reasonable. The problem was that my body apparently wasn't interested in my logic. Because my body had already noticed. Long before my mind caught up, I'd be driving somewhere. Completely focused on work. Or at least I thought I was. Then I'd stop at a red light and automatically reach for my phone. Not consciously. Not intentionally. Just instinctively. Unlock. Check. Nothing. Lock. Put it down. Then 10 minutes later, do the exact same thing. Not because I expected a message. At least that's what I told myself. But then why check? Why the repeated motion? Why the strange anticipation? I remember catching myself doing it one afternoon. I was sitting in a parking lot. Engine running. Air conditioning on. Phone in my hand. And suddenly I had this weird moment of self-awareness. Like watching myself from outside my own body. What are you doing? I don't know. You're checking again. I know. For what? That silence answered more than any explanation could. Because sometimes we know exactly what we're looking for. We just don't want to admit it. That's the strange thing about emotional activation. It often starts as behavior, not awareness. The body starts reacting before the story catches up, before the explanations arrive, before the pride gets involved, and especially for people who are used to avoiding difficult emotions. The feeling often gets rerouted into something else. Work becomes more important. Projects suddenly become urgent. The gym becomes an obsession. The house gets cleaned at midnight. Emails get answered immediately. Anything except sitting still long enough to ask, why am I suddenly so restless? I've seen men do this. I've done this. You start organizing things that don't need organizing. You become weirdly productive. Not because you're inspired, because you're trying to outrun something. The problem is you don't even know what you're outrunning yet. I remember cleaning my apartment one night. Not normal cleaning. Aggressive cleaning. The kind where you're wiping surfaces that are already clean. Rearranging things that don't need rearranging. Opening drawers. Closing drawers. Finding tasks just to keep moving. At some point I stopped and laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was obvious. I was avoiding something. I just didn't know exactly what. Or maybe I knew. Maybe I simply didn't want to say it out loud. Because saying it out loud would make it real. And once something becomes real, you have to deal with it. The truth is, sometimes missing someone doesn't feel like longing. Sometimes it feels like irritation. That sounds awful. But it's true. You become annoyed more easily. Traffic bothers you more. Small inconveniences feel larger. People asking simple questions somehow become exhausting. And the entire time you're convinced the irritation is about everything except the actual thing causing it. Because admitting vulnerability can feel more uncomfortable than carrying it. Especially for people who learned early in life that emotions should be managed privately. Contained. Controlled. I think a lot of men grow up becoming experts at emotional translation. Not emotional expression. Translation. Loneliness becomes work. Fear becomes logic. Sadness becomes exhaustion. Attachment becomes annoyance. Longing becomes distraction. And after enough years of doing that, you stop recognizing your own emotional language. You only see the symptoms, not the source. I remember lying awake one night. Nothing dramatic. No tears. No emotional breakdown. Just awake. Staring at the ceiling. Watching random shadows move across the room. The digital clock glowing beside the bed. 2:14 a.m. Then 2:47. Then 3:19. The mind doing what minds do when the world gets quiet. Replaying things. Not major moments. Tiny moments. Fragments. A joke she made 3 weeks ago. A random photo she sent. The way she once paused before answering a question. And what's strange is that during the relationship, or whatever version of connection it was, those moments barely registered. But now they wouldn't leave. It's almost embarrassing. You spend months ignoring things. Then suddenly you're emotionally haunted by the way somebody laughed in the middle of a sentence. Human beings are weird. There really isn't a more sophisticated way to say it. We're weird. We convince ourselves we're detached. Independent. Unaffected. Then one small shift in somebody's energy rearranges our entire internal weather system. And we still insist we're fine. I remember opening her profile once. Then immediately closing it. Then opening it again. Then closing it again. Not messaging. Not liking anything. Not interacting. Just looking. Which is probably one of the most modern forms of emotional confusion ever invented. You don't want contact, but you want evidence. Evidence that they still exist. Evidence that they're still somewhere in the world. Evidence that your connection wasn't imagined. Then afterward you feel ridiculous. Why are you doing this? You're acting crazy. No, you're not. Then what is this? Good question. That's the conversation nobody hears. The internal argument. The private negotiation. The constant attempt to appear unaffected while quietly being affected. And here's the part that took me years to understand. The panic wasn't actually about losing her. Not entirely. Part of the panic came from losing certainty. Because certainty is addictive. When someone consistently reaches for you emotionally, you don't have to wonder where you stand. Even if the relationship itself is complicated. Even if the future is unclear. There is still a signal. Still evidence. Still contact. Then suddenly the signal weakens. And the uncertainty rushes in. Now your mind has room to create stories. Questions. Doubts. Possibilities. Maybe she doesn't care anymore. Maybe she moved on. Maybe she's tired. Maybe she's happier. Maybe she finally stopped waiting. And uncertainty has a way of multiplying itself at night, especially when nobody is around to interrupt it. That's why this stage feels so strange. Because on the outside, nothing dramatic is happening. He's still going to work. Still answering texts. Still functioning. Still laughing at jokes. Still posting normal things. Life continues. But internally, something has shifted. A small crack has appeared. And through that crack comes awareness. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just little flashes. Little moments. Little realizations. The hand reaching for the phone before the thought arrives. The unnecessary late-night drive. The sudden inability to focus on a movie. The random memory showing up during a meeting. The urge to check if she's viewed something. The disappointment when she hasn't. The relief when she has. The immediate shame for caring. Then caring anyway. And that's usually when the truth starts getting closer. Not because he's ready for it. Not because he's emotionally evolved. Not because he's suddenly wise. Actually, usually the opposite. He's confused. Contradictory. Avoiding. Half-aware. Trying to convince himself he's unaffected while evidence keeps appearing everywhere. And somewhere beneath all that noise, a quiet realization begins forming. One he still isn't ready to fully admit. Maybe this matters more than he thought. Maybe her absence isn't bothering him because she disappeared. Maybe it's bothering him because he finally noticed how much of her presence he had stopped seeing. And that realization is usually where the real story begins. I think, "I need space" might be one of the most misunderstood sentences in relationships. Not because it's always dishonest. And not because it's always true. But because sometimes even the person saying it doesn't fully understand what they mean. That's the uncomfortable part. We like clean explanations. We like knowing exactly why people leave, why they pull away, why they become distant. But real life rarely works like that. Sometimes a person says they need space because they genuinely do. Sometimes they're overwhelmed. Sometimes they're exhausted. Sometimes life is falling apart in ways they don't know how to explain. And sometimes they're scared. Not scared of the other person. Scared of themselves. Scared of what they're feeling. Scared of what those feelings might require from them. I've been there before. And if I'm honest, there were moments when I used the exact right words for the completely wrong reasons. Not intentionally. At least I don't think so. That's what makes this difficult to talk about. Because people want villains. People want certainty. People want someone to blame. But often it's much messier than that. I remember one conversation years ago. She was sitting across from me. There was nothing wrong. At least nothing obvious. No argument. No tension. No crisis. The kind of evening that should have felt peaceful. And yet I could feel something happening inside me. A strange pressure. Like the connection was becoming more real than I had prepared for. More serious. More meaningful. And instead of moving toward it, I felt myself pulling away. Even while sitting right there. Which sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. But maybe some of you know exactly what I mean. Your body is present. Your mind is present. You're looking directly at the person. And somehow emotionally you're already halfway out the door. Not because you don't care. Sometimes because you care too much. I know that explanation gets abused. People use it as an excuse. But occasionally it's true. Sometimes intimacy creates panic. Not romantic movie panic. Not dramatic panic. The quieter kind. The kind that whispers. This matters. This could hurt. This could change your life. And for some people, that realization doesn't create closeness. It creates distance. I remember driving home after that conversation. Everything had gone fine. Nothing happened. Yet I felt restless. agitated. Like I needed air. Like I needed freedom. Like I needed to be alone. And for years I told myself that meant the relationship wasn't right. That was my interpretation. My evidence. See, I need distance. Therefore this must not be what I want. Simple. Logical. Comforting. The only problem was that the feeling never actually disappeared. The distance gave me temporary relief. But not peace. There's a difference. Relief feels like escaping pressure. Peace feels like resolution. And I confused those two things for a long time. A lot of people do. Especially emotionally avoidant people. Although honestly, I think labels get thrown around too casually these days. Not everybody who pulls away is avoidant. Not everybody who needs solitude is running. Not everybody who asks for space is emotionally unavailable. Sometimes people genuinely need room to think. Need room to breathe. Need room to process. But then there are other times. The harder times. The more honest times. The times when space becomes a hiding place. And that's where things get complicated. Because hiding places often feel safe. At first, you tell yourself you're protecting your peace. Protecting your independence. Protecting your freedom. And maybe part of that is true. But another part, a much quieter part, might be protecting you from vulnerability. I remember saying those exact words once. I just need some space. And technically I wasn't lying. I did need space. The question was why. That was the part one wasn't examining. Space from what? Space from stress? Space from pressure? Space from responsibility? Or space from feeling something I didn't know how to handle? At the time, I couldn't answer. If someone had asked me directly, I probably would have become defensive. Because defensiveness is often what happens when somebody accidentally gets close to the truth. Not always, but often. It's strange looking back now. I can see moments where she was simply trying to understand me. Not trap me. Not control me. Not force commitment. Just understand. And somehow that felt threatening. Which sounds unfair. Because it was. But emotional fear isn't always fair. Fear doesn't care whether somebody is being kind. Fear only cares whether something feels dangerous. And intimacy can feel dangerous. Not because the other person is dangerous. Because being known is dangerous. At least that's how it feels sometimes. Being known means being visible. Visible means vulnerable. Vulnerable means uncertain. And uncertainty terrifies people who rely on control. Even if they don't realize that's what they're doing. There was a period where I kept repeating the same pattern. Get close. Pull away. Miss her. Come back. Feel overwhelmed. Pull away again. The pattern itself became exhausting. Not just for her. For me too. Because eventually you start noticing your own contradictions. You start hearing yourself. You start realizing that your behavior and your feelings aren't matching. And that's uncomfortable. One night I remember sitting alone in my apartment. The room was dark except for the light above the stove. I hadn't turned on the rest of the lights. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't feel like it. Maybe I was avoiding my own thoughts. Maybe both. My phone was on the counter. Her conversation was open. I typed a message. Deleted it. Typed another one. Deleted that too. Then I sat there staring at the screen. And that's when the internal conversation started. You miss her. No, I don't. Then why are you here? I don't know. You wanted space. I did. Do you still? That silence lasted longer than I expected. Because the truth wasn't clean. Part of me did want space. Part of me wanted closeness. Part of me wanted freedom. Part of me wanted connection. Both things were true. That's the thing nobody prepares you for. Sometimes contradictory emotions coexist. At full volume. At the same time. You can miss someone and feel trapped. You can love somebody and need distance. You can want intimacy and resent the vulnerability it creates. You can want someone to stay while simultaneously pushing them away. Human beings are not nearly as consistent as we pretend to be. And nowhere is that more obvious than in relationships. Especially when emotions start getting serious. I think some men spend years believing that certainty should arrive before action. That they should know exactly what they feel before moving forward. Exactly what they want before committing. Exactly what the future looks like before taking a risk. But emotions don't work that way. Life doesn't work that way. Sometimes you move while uncertain. Sometimes you love while uncertain. Sometimes you stay while uncertain. And sometimes the pursuit of certainty becomes its own form of avoidance. Because certainty never arrives. Not completely. Not in the way we imagine. So people keep waiting. Keep analyzing. Keep needing more time. More space. More distance. Meanwhile, the relationship quietly changes shape around them. I think that's what many people misunderstand when a man says he needs space. The statement itself isn't necessarily the issue. The issue is whether he's using that space to understand himself. Or to escape himself. Those are very different things. One leads somewhere. The other just creates a larger circle. And circles are exhausting. Eventually you end up in the same emotional place you left. Only now there's more regret attached to it. Because time passed. Because opportunities passed. Because somebody stopped waiting. That's the part people rarely talk about. Space feels temporary when you're the one asking for it. But it doesn't always feel temporary to the person experiencing it. They're living through those days too. Those weeks. Those months. They're adapting. Adjusting. Learning how to exist without reaching for you. And while you're trying to figure out your feelings, they may be figuring out how to let go. Which creates one of the most painful realizations a person can have. The realization that somebody respected your request. And in doing so, slowly learned how to live without your presence. Not out of anger. Not revenge. Not punishment. Just survival. And often by the time that realization arrives, it's already changed something. Because distance has a strange effect on people. Sometimes it creates clarity. Sometimes it creates loss. Sometimes both. And maybe that's the hardest truth hiding underneath those three simple words. I need space. Sometimes the person saying it believes they're pressing pause. When in reality, life is still moving. The other person is still changing. The connection is still evolving. Nothing is actually standing still. And one day he wakes up expecting to return to exactly what he left behind. Only to discover that while he was trying to escape the pressure of the connection itself was learning how to exist without him. And that realization can hit harder than the original fear ever did. The strange thing about missing someone is that it almost never starts with the big memories. At least not in my experience. It isn't the first kiss. It isn't the dramatic goodbye. It isn't the deep conversations at 2 a.m. People think those are the memories that haunt you. Sometimes they do. But usually not at first. Usually it's something much smaller. Something so ordinary that you barely noticed it when it happened. And somehow that's what stays. That's what your mind keeps returning to when the connection changes. I didn't understand this until it happened to me. For the longest time, I thought if I ever lost someone important, I would spend my days replaying the major moments. The milestones. The turning points. The obvious things. Instead, my brain became obsessed with details that made absolutely no sense. The way she held a coffee cup with both hands when it was cold outside. The way she'd stop talking mid-sentence when she got distracted by something funny. The specific pause before she answered certain questions. Not because she didn't know what to say. Because she actually thought about her answers. Tiny things. Almost embarrassingly tiny things. The kind of details you'd never write down. The kind of details you'd never think mattered. Until suddenly they matter more than anything. I remember being in a grocery store one evening. Nothing emotional about it. Just a normal Tuesday. Fluorescent lights. Shopping cart wheels making that annoying rattling sound. A half-finished grocery list in my phone. I was reaching for a box of cereal when something happened. Not a breakdown. Not some movie scene. Just a memory. Out of nowhere. I remembered her standing in front of a shelf months earlier arguing with me about which pasta sauce was better. That's it. That's the memory. Not romance. Not intimacy. Pasta sauce. And somehow I stood there frozen for a few seconds. Because suddenly I could hear her voice. The exact tone. The exact expression. The ridiculous confidence she had about being right. And for a brief moment it felt like she was standing there again. Then she wasn't. And that's the part people don't prepare you for. How quickly a memory can arrive. And how quickly it can disappear. Leaving behind this strange ache that didn't exist 30 seconds earlier. You go into a store thinking about groceries. You leave thinking about somebody's laugh. It's absurd. Human memory is absurd. Especially when attachment gets involved. The brain doesn't organize experiences logically. It organizes them emotionally. Which means the moments that stay are often the moments carrying emotional weight you didn't recognize at the time. I think that's why the memory loop catches so many people off guard. Because by the time it starts, they think they've already processed everything. They think they've moved on. Or at least started to. Then suddenly a random detail ambushes them. A smell. A song. A phrase. A location. And there they are again. Back inside a moment they thought was gone. I remember hearing somebody laugh once while walking through a parking lot. Not her laugh. Not even close. But close enough. Just similar enough. My head turned before I could stop it. Immediately. Instinctively. Like my body reacted before my brain had time to participate. And for half a second, one stupid half second, I thought it might be her. Then reality returned. And I felt ridiculous. I actually laughed at myself. Standing there next to my car. Why did you do that? Because part of you still listens for her. That answer arrived before I wanted it to. Because that's what memory does. It reveals things. Not always pleasant things. Not always convenient things. Sometimes memory exposes attachments we thought we'd already outgrown. Sometimes it exposes feelings we claimed didn't exist. And that's where the loop begins. Not because you're trying to obsess. Not because you're trying to hold on. But because your brain is attempting to reconcile two conflicting realities. Reality 1. She's no longer showing up the way she used to. Reality 2. Parts of you still expect her to. The tension between those realities creates repetition. The mind keeps circling. Reviewing. Replaying. Looking for something it missed. Looking for meaning. Looking for certainty. I used to think the memory loop was about the past. Now I'm not so sure. I think sometimes it's about unfinished emotions. Not unfinished relationships. Those aren't always the same thing. A relationship can end. A connection can change. But emotions don't operate on deadlines. They don't check calendars. They don't care about timelines. They move at their own pace. And while they're moving, the mind keeps revisiting old moments, trying to understand something the heart hasn't fully accepted yet. I remember one night driving home after work. Nothing unusual. Same route. Same traffic. Same roads I'd driven 100 times. Then a particular intersection appeared. And suddenly I remembered a conversation we'd had there months earlier. Not even an important conversation. Actually, I can't remember most of what was said. What I remember is her laughing. That's it. Just laughing. And somehow that memory followed me the entire drive home. I parked. Went inside. Made dinner. Watched television. Still there. That tiny moment. Still replaying. It's strange how memory works. You forget entire months. Then remember 17 seconds with perfect clarity. The way sunlight came through a windshield. The way somebody looked away while smiling. The way their voice sounded when they said your name. Those details survive. Everything else disappears. And honestly, that's what makes the memory loop so frustrating. Because it rarely gives answers. People think if they replay enough memories, they'll finally understand something. But often the opposite happens. The more you replay them, the less certain you become. Was she happier than I realized? Did she feel lonely? Did I miss something? Dili mi sonasten here. Did she know how much I cared? Did I know? The questions multiply. The answers don't. That's why late-night memory loops are so dangerous. Not because they're dramatic, because they're persuasive. At midnight, a memory feels like evidence. At 2 a.m., it feels like destiny. At 3 a.m., it feels like something you should absolutely act on. Then morning arrives, and everything looks different again. But the emotional residue remains. I remember opening old messages once. Something I told myself I wasn't going to do. And for a few minutes, I wasn't even looking for anything specific. Just scrolling. Reading. Revisiting. Then I found a conversation that seemed completely ordinary at the time. A random exchange about a bad day she was having. A few jokes. A few supportive comments. Nothing remarkable. Except now it felt different. Now I could see the effort. The consistency. The care. Things I had noticed before. But apparently not enough. That's another painful part of the memory loop. You start seeing things more clearly after they're no longer available. Not because they've changed, because your perspective has. And clarity that arrives late has a particular kind of sadness attached to it. Not devastating sadness, just quiet regret. The kind that sits beside you instead of attacking you. The kind that follows you through ordinary days. The kind that whispers instead of shouts. I think that's why people get trapped in these loops. They're not actually chasing memories. They're chasing understanding. Trying to locate the exact moment everything shifted. Trying to identify the sentence that mattered. The decision that mattered. The opportunity they missed. But relationships rarely break because of one moment. And feelings rarely disappear because of one moment. Most things happen gradually. So the brain keeps searching for a clean answer that doesn't exist. And because it can't find one, it keeps replaying. Reviewing. Revisiting. Again. And again. And again. Sometimes I think the most painful memories aren't the obviously romantic ones. They're the ordinary ones. Because ordinary moments were never supposed to become memories. They were supposed to become more life. More conversations. More routines. More shared experiences. When those futures disappear, the ordinary moments suddenly become precious. Not because they were extraordinary, because they were alive. And now they're gone. Or at least inaccessible. That's when the memory loop becomes something else. Not obsession. Not longing. Not even regret. Something quieter. A growing awareness. An awareness that people often leave traces of themselves inside our daily lives. And we don't notice those traces until their presence stops creating new ones. Then suddenly we're surrounded by reminders. A restaurant. A song. A joke. A coffee order. A parking lot. A voice that sounds almost like hers. And each reminder asks the same uncomfortable question. Did you realize how much she had become part of your world while she was still standing inside it? Most people want to answer yes. Honestly, a lot of the time the answer is no. Not fully. Not until later. Not until the memories start arriving uninvited. Not until the silence gets louder. Not until the mind begins collecting tiny moments it once ignored. And that's when the memory loop reveals its real purpose. It isn't trying to torture him. It isn't trying to keep him stuck. It's trying to show him something. Something he couldn't see when her presence felt permanent. Something hidden inside all those ordinary moments. The truth that often arrives too late. That what we miss most isn't always the grand love story. Sometimes it's the small pieces of everyday life we never imagined could disappear. And somehow, Those are the pieces that stay with us the longest. There is a moment that happens after someone pulls back. Not immediately. Usually not in the beginning. The beginning is confusion. The beginning is distraction. The beginning is trying to convince yourself that nothing has changed. But eventually something else starts happening. Something quieter. Something harder to admit. You begin realizing that her presence was doing more for you than you ever acknowledged. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because now you're forced to ask a question nobody likes asking themselves. Do I miss her? Or do I miss what she gave me? At first glance, those seem like the same thing. But they aren't. Not always. And the difference between those two questions can make a person confront parts of themselves they've spent years avoiding. I remember going through a period where I genuinely believed I was missing someone. Then one night I caught myself replaying something. Not a memory. Not a conversation. A feeling. The feeling of being understood. The feeling of somebody being interested in my day. The feeling of having somebody notice things I never said out loud. And suddenly I had this uncomfortable realization. Part of what I missed wasn't her specifically. Part of what I missed was how I felt around her. That realization didn't make me feel better. It actually made me feel worse. Because it felt selfish. And maybe it was. At least partially. But human beings are complicated. Relationships aren't built on pure intentions. They're built on needs. Comfort. Attachment. Validation. Safety. Recognition. And most of us don't realize how much we're receiving until the supply disappears. That's the strange thing about emotional support. When it's consistent, it becomes invisible. The same way we talked about her presence becoming invisible. But this goes deeper. Because sometimes her presence wasn't just making life better. It was quietly regulating parts of him he didn't know needed regulating. I know that sounds overly psychological. But stay with me. Think about the last time somebody consistently cared about you. Not dramatically. Not obsessively. Just consistently. They check in. They ask questions. They notice changes in your mood. They remember things you mentioned 3 weeks ago. They make you feel seen. After enough time, your nervous system adapts to that experience. Not consciously. Just naturally. It starts feeling normal. Expected. Part of everyday life. Then suddenly it's gone. And now you're left alone with emotional conditions you haven't experienced in months. Maybe years. And at first you don't recognize what's happening. You just know something feels off. The days feel flatter. The victories feel quieter. The disappointments feel heavier. You find yourself reaching for your phone after something good happens. Then remembering. You find yourself wanting to tell her something. Then stopping. And those moments reveal something important. Not because you're weak. Not because you depended on her. But because human beings are relational creatures. We organize parts of our emotional lives around connection. The problem begins when we start taking that connection for granted. Or worse, when we convince ourselves we never needed it in the first place. I think a lot of men struggle here. Not because they're incapable of emotional awareness. Because many of them were taught to minimize their emotional needs. So when somebody starts meeting those needs, they don't necessarily recognize it. They just enjoy the experience. Then the experience disappears. And suddenly they're trying to solve an emotional problem they never admitted existed. I remember a specific afternoon. I had just finished something important at work. A project I'd been stressed about for months. The kind of thing that normally would have felt satisfying. And for a few seconds it did. Then automatically, without thinking, I reached for my phone. Not to post about it. Not to celebrate publicly. I wanted to tell her. That's what my body did before my brain got involved. I wanted to tell her. Then reality caught up. And I put the phone back down. What surprised me wasn't the disappointment. What surprised me was how automatic the impulse had become. She had become part of the experience itself. Part of how I processed life. And now that pathway was missing. Nobody talks enough about that. The loss of shared witnessing. Sometimes you don't miss the person first. Sometimes you miss being witnessed by them. You miss somebody knowing the story behind your day. You miss somebody understanding why a certain achievement matters. You miss somebody who already knows the context. Because starting over with new people is exhausting. Explaining everything from the beginning is exhausting. And there are some people who know your emotional landscape so well that their absence creates silence in places you didn't know existed. That's where ego enters the conversation. Not in the arrogant way people usually mean. In a much more ordinary way. The ego likes familiarity. The ego likes reassurance. The ego likes knowing where it stands. The ego likes being chosen, being noticed, being valued. And when somebody consistently provides those things, we often assume they'll continue. Not because we're bad people, because certainty feels comfortable. Then she pulls back, and suddenly the reassurance disappears. Now there's uncertainty. Now there are questions. Now there are gaps. And the ego hates gaps. The ego wants answers immediately. Why isn't she reaching out? Why is she different? What changed? Does she still care? Did I do something? Has she moved on? The mind starts generating theories. Not because it loves drama, because uncertainty feels unbearable. I remember checking my phone one night and realizing something embarrassing. I wasn't even hoping for a specific message anymore. I was hoping for evidence. Any evidence. A reaction. A view. A sign. Something. And when I recognized that, I felt uncomfortable. Because suddenly I wasn't looking at her behavior. I was looking at my own. What exactly are you waiting for? I don't know. Yes, you do. That internal conversation got very quiet after that. Because the answer wasn't flattering. Part of me wanted reassurance. Part of me wanted confirmation that I still mattered. Part of me wanted proof that the connection still existed. Which is an incredibly human thing to want. But it's also something many people are reluctant to admit. Especially people who see themselves as independent, strong, detached, self-sufficient. Then life introduces someone whose attention quietly becomes meaningful. And all those self-definitions become a little more complicated. I think that's why her withdrawal can feel so powerful. Not because she's trying to create power. Most of the time she isn't. Most of the time she's simply stopping behaviors she can no longer sustain. She's tired. She's protecting herself. She's matching the energy she receives. She's focusing on her own life. Meanwhile, he's experiencing the consequences of an emotional ecosystem changing. And because the change is internal, it's easy to misunderstand. He thinks he's missing her. And maybe he is. But he's also missing certainty. Missing validation. Missing familiarity. Missing emotional access. Missing the version of himself that existed when her attention was still available. And sorting through those layers takes time. A lot of time. Because nobody wants to believe they've become attached to emotional reassurance. Especially if they've spent years pretending they don't need it. But eventually honesty starts arriving. Usually in small pieces. Usually late at night. Usually when distractions stop working. I remember sitting alone one evening after weeks of trying to stay busy. Work. Friends. Projects. Exercise. All the usual strategies. And suddenly a thought appeared. Not dramatic. Just honest. You miss her. Do I? Yes. Or do I miss being wanted? That question stayed with me. Because both answers felt true. And that was the problem. People often want emotions to be pure. Simple. Easy to explain. Real life doesn't work that way. Sometimes we miss the person. Sometimes we miss the role they played. Sometimes we miss both simultaneously. And untangling those threads can take months. Maybe longer. What makes this stage so difficult is that the ego doesn't like self-examination. It prefers blame. It prefers certainty. It prefers stories where someone else is responsible. But eventually the noise dies down enough to hear something deeper. A quieter truth. One that's harder to run from. Maybe her attention wasn't guaranteed. Maybe her emotional availability wasn't infinite. Maybe the comfort she provided wasn't something to casually assume would always be there. And maybe, just maybe, you weren't nearly as unaffected as you pretended to be. That's the realization that begins changing everything. Because once the ego loses its audience, once the reassurance disappears, once the familiar validation stops arriving, you're left face to face with yourself. Not the version of yourself reflected through her attention. Not the version of yourself supported by her consistency. Just you. Alone with your thoughts. Alone with your contradictions. Alone with the uncomfortable possibility that you cared far more than you ever admitted. And strangely enough, that's often the first truly honest moment in the entire story. There comes a point in this kind of story where the explanation, "I miss her," stops feeling complete. Not because it's wrong, because it's incomplete. By now he's already been through the confusion, the restlessness, the memory loops, the late-night conversations with himself, the checking, the pretending not to check, the whole exhausting cycle of caring and then trying to convince himself he doesn't. But eventually another question starts appearing. And honestly, it's not a comfortable one. It wasn't comfortable for me. It probably won't be comfortable for him either. The question is this: why is her distance affecting me this much? Not why do I miss her? That's easier. Why does her withdrawal feel so disruptive? Why does it keep showing up in places it shouldn't? Why does it feel like something is unsettled even when life is technically moving forward? And somewhere inside that question sits an awkward truth that most people would rather avoid. Sometimes what hurts isn't just losing connection. Sometimes it's losing predictability, losing access, losing certainty, losing control. Now, before anybody gets defensive, let me clarify something. Control isn't always manipulation. Control isn't always toxic. Control isn't always some villainous attempt to dominate another person. Sometimes control is much more ordinary than that. Much more human. Sometimes control simply means becoming comfortable with a pattern. Comfortable with knowing what happens next. Comfortable with emotional access. Comfortable with somebody being available. And once that pattern disappears, something inside us starts panicking. Not because we're evil. Because uncertainty exposes attachment. I remember a period in my life where someone always responded. Not immediately. Not obsessively. Just consistently. If I reached out, she'd answer. If I disappeared for a while, she'd still be there. If things got weird between us, somehow we'd find our way back into conversation. The pattern became familiar. Reliable. Predictable. Then one day it wasn't. And what shocked me wasn't sadness. It was discomfort. A strange discomfort I couldn't explain. Because logically nothing catastrophic had happened. She hadn't attacked me. She hadn't created drama. She hadn't even necessarily left. She just wasn't as available as she used to be. And apparently that tiny shift was enough to expose things I didn't know were there. I found myself wondering what she was doing. Wondering who she was talking to. Wondering whether she still thought about me. Not obsessively. Not every minute. Just enough to annoy me. And that's what made it interesting. Because the curiosity felt disproportionate. I knew it. Even while it was happening. Why do you care? I don't know. Yes, you do. No, I don't. Really? That silence again. The same silence that keeps showing up throughout stories like this. The silence that appears whenever we're standing near a truth we'd rather avoid. Because the answer wasn't flattering. The answer was that part of me had gotten used to access. Gotten used to knowing she was there. Gotten used to emotional availability being an option. Not necessarily something I appreciated every day. Just something I assumed. And assumptions are dangerous. Especially in relationships. Because assumptions create invisible expectations. The expectation that she'll answer. The expectation that she'll understand. The expectation that she'll stay emotionally connected even when you're inconsistent. The expectation that things will remain available whenever you're finally ready. And when those expectations stop being met, people often call it loss. But sometimes what they're actually experiencing is uncertainty. The loss of certainty. The loss of predictability. And those things can feel surprisingly painful. I remember opening my phone one evening and realizing something had changed. Not externally. Internally. Before, if I saw her name appear, it felt normal. Now, if I saw her name appear, it felt significant. Which sounds ridiculous. But that's what scarcity does. When something becomes less available, your awareness of it increases. The attention you once gave casually suddenly becomes concentrated. Focused. Hyper-aware. It's like walking past the same painting every day without noticing it. Then one day someone removes it. Now you can't stop thinking about it. Not because the painting changed, because your access to it did. I think this is where many people accidentally confuse love with control, or attachment with love, or familiarity with love. They're not the same thing. They overlap, sometimes heavily, but they aren't identical. And sorting through them requires an honesty most people aren't prepared for. Because eventually you have to ask yourself, do I miss her? Or do I miss being able to reach her whenever I wanted? Do I miss the connection? Or do I miss the certainty of the connection? Do I miss who she is? Or do I miss knowing she was emotionally available? Those questions don't have easy answers. At least they didn't for me. Sometimes I answered one way. Sometimes another. Sometimes both felt true. Which is frustrating because human beings love clean conclusions. Unfortunately, emotions rarely cooperate. I remember one night lying awake replaying a conversation we'd had months earlier. Nothing special. Just a normal conversation. And suddenly I realized something. At the time, I wasn't paying attention because I assumed there would be thousands more conversations. Thousands more opportunities. More chances. More time. That's one of the hidden forms of control people rarely discuss. The illusion of unlimited future access. The assumption that somebody will still be there later. The assumption that emotional doors remain open indefinitely. And honestly, sometimes they do. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes people get tired. Sometimes they stop reaching. Sometimes they stop waiting. Sometimes they stop investing energy where energy isn't being returned. Not because they hate you. Because they're human. Because they have limits. And when that happens, a strange role reversal often occurs. The person who once felt secure now feels uncertain. The person who once had emotional access now experiences emotional distance. The person who once controlled the pace of the connection suddenly doesn't. And that's where things get really uncomfortable. Because uncertainty forces self-awareness. You start noticing your own behavior. You start noticing contradictions. You start noticing how much of your confidence depended on assumptions. I remember checking whether she had viewed something I'd posted. Not because I cared about social media. At least that's what I told myself. Then I caught myself checking again. And again. And suddenly the truth became difficult to ignore. This isn't about social media. This is about reassurance. It's about wanting evidence. Evidence that you're still relevant. Evidence that you still matter. Evidence that the emotional thread hasn't completely disappeared. And the moment I realized that, I felt embarrassed. Not because wanting reassurance is shameful. Because I had spent so much time pretending I didn't need it. That's another thing nobody talks about. The people who act the most detached aren't always detached. Sometimes they're simply invested in appearing detached. There's a difference. A huge difference. One is emotional reality. The other is emotional image management. And when somebody pulls back, image management becomes harder. Because now there are fewer places to hide. Fewer distractions. Fewer comforting assumptions. the reality starts becoming visible. I think that's why her energy can suddenly feel more powerful when she withdraws. Not because she's trying to create power. Not because she's playing games. Most of the time, she's simply reclaiming her attention, refocusing her life, redirecting her energy elsewhere. The power comes from what her absence reveals. It reveals dependence where independence was assumed. It reveals attachment where detachment was claimed. It reveals uncertainty where certainty once existed. And perhaps most painfully, it reveals care. Real care. The kind that wasn't fully acknowledged while everything still felt secure. I remember having one final internal conversation about this. Or maybe not final. These conversations tend to return. But this one stayed with me. Why is this bothering you? Because things changed. Things always change. I know. Then what is it? You can't predict her anymore. The answer arrived quietly. Almost annoyingly quietly. And then another voice followed. And you cared more than you admitted. That second answer hit harder. Because it explained everything. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough. Enough to understand why uncertainty felt so uncomfortable. Enough to understand why her distance felt heavier than it should. Enough to understand why control had become part of the story without me realizing it. Not control over her. Control over certainty. Control over access. Control over emotional predictability. And once those things disappeared, all that remained was the truth. A truth most people spend months trying to avoid. Maybe her withdrawal wasn't creating feelings. Maybe it was exposing them. Maybe the discomfort wasn't coming from losing control of her. Maybe it was coming from losing control of the story he'd been telling himself. The story that said he wasn't that attached. The story that said he didn't care that much. The story that said she'd always be there. Because once that story falls apart, he has to face something much more vulnerable. The possibility that her presence mattered far more than he ever allowed himself to believe. And for some men, that's when the real unraveling begins. One of the most confusing things a person can experience is watching someone become distant immediately after a moment of closeness. Especially when the closeness felt real. Especially when the vulnerability felt genuine. Especially when everything seemed fine. Maybe you've experienced it. A conversation that lasted for hours. A night where walls came down. A moment where two people stopped pretending. And then, something changes. Not dramatically. Not overnight. Just enough to feel it. The messages become slower. The energy shifts. The warmth cools. And suddenly you're left wondering what happened. What did I do? What changed? Was any of it real? The difficult truth is that sometimes nothing went wrong. Sometimes the closeness itself is what triggered the retreat. And I know how frustrating that sounds. Because it sounds irrational. Honestly, it is irrational. Human beings are irrational sometimes. Especially when emotions become real. I've seen this happen. I've done this. And admitting that isn't particularly flattering. Because from the outside it looks immature. Sometimes it is immature. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's confusion. Usually it's some combination of both. I remember one specific night years ago. We had talked for hours. Not surface-level conversation. Not the usual jokes and distractions. Real conversation. The kind that leaves you feeling strangely exposed afterward. The kind where you accidentally tell the truth. The kind where you reveal things you normally keep hidden. Old disappointments. Old fears. Things that still hurt. Things you normally package neatly before showing them to other people. And for a few hours it felt good. Actually, more than good. It felt relieving. Like setting down something heavy you didn't realize you'd been carrying. I remember going to sleep that night feeling closer to her than I ever had before. Then I woke up the next morning and wanted distance. Not because I regretted the conversation. Not because she had done anything wrong. Not because I cared less. I just wanted distance. And that contradiction bothered me. Even then. Why? What changed overnight? Nothing. That's what made it confusing. The feelings hadn't disappeared. The connection hadn't disappeared. But suddenly there was this urge to pull back. To reclaim space. To be alone. To stop feeling so visible. And that's when I started noticing something about myself. Something I didn't particularly like. Sometimes after intimacy, I became hyper-aware of intimacy. It's difficult to explain. Imagine sitting in a dark room. Your eyes adjust slowly. Everything feels comfortable. Then somebody suddenly turns on a bright light. Nothing is actually wrong. You can see more clearly. But your first instinct is still to squint. To look away. To adjust. Sometimes emotional closeness feels like that. The visibility itself becomes overwhelming. Not because it's bad. Because it's intense. And intensity affects people differently. Some people move toward it. Some people freeze. Some people run. Some people do all three depending on the day. I think a lot of people assume emotional avoidance always looks cold. Calculated. Deliberate. But often it looks much messier than that. The person is confused too. They're not sitting there plotting emotional distance. They're sitting there wondering why they suddenly feel uncomfortable. I remember staring at a text message once. A simple message. A caring message. A normal message. And instead of feeling comforted, I felt pressure. Not because she was pressuring me. She wasn't. The pressure was entirely internal. The message represented closeness. Connection. Expectations. Possibilities. Things becoming real. And part of me wanted all of those things. Another part wanted to disappear for 3 days. Those parts existed simultaneously. That's the piece people often miss. Contradictory emotions can coexist. At full volume. Without canceling each other out. You can want connection and fear it. You can miss someone while avoiding them. You can care deeply while acting indifferent. You can crave intimacy and resent the vulnerability it creates. Human beings do this all the time. Especially people who have spent years relying on emotional self-protection. I remember a friend asking me once, "If you liked her so much, why did you pull away?" And I couldn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't know. Because the answer sounded ridiculous. Eventually I said something like, "I think it felt too real." Even saying it felt embarrassing. Too real? What does that even mean? But it was the closest thing to the truth. Sometimes reality is harder to manage than fantasy. Fantasy asks for nothing. Fantasy requires no risk. Fantasy can't reject you. Fantasy can't disappoint you. Fantasy doesn't need consistency. But real intimacy? Real intimacy eventually asks something of you. Presence. Vulnerability. Honesty. Action. And sometimes people discover they're less prepared for those things than they thought. That's where the retreat begins. Not because feelings disappeared. Because feelings became impossible to ignore. I remember becoming colder after certain moments of closeness. Not intentionally. Actually, that's what bothered me most. I would notice it happening while it was happening. My responses becoming shorter. My energy becoming flatter. My attention drifting. And a small voice in the back of my mind would ask, "What are you doing?" "I don't know." "Yes, you do." "No, I don't." "Then why are you pulling away?" The answer was never simple. Because there wasn't one answer. There were several. Fear. Overwhelm. Pride. Vulnerability. Uncertainty. Old habits. The desire to maintain control. The desire to avoid disappointment. All of them mixing together. Creating behavior that didn't even make sense to me. And that's another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes people know exactly what they're doing. And sometimes they genuinely don't. Not every retreat is strategic. Not every withdrawal is manipulation. Sometimes it's just emotional confusion playing itself out in real time. Unfortunately, emotional confusion still hurts people. Intentions don't erase consequences. I learned that the hard way. There were moments when I genuinely believed I needed distance. Then after creating that distance, I missed her. Not a week later. Sometimes the same day. Which sounds absurd. Because it is. I would create the thing I thought I wanted. Then feel unsettled once I had it. The silence would arrive. The space would arrive. The freedom would arrive. And then something else would arrive too. Loneliness. Not dramatic loneliness. Not movie scene loneliness. Just little moments. A funny story with nobody to tell. A difficult day with nobody who already understood the context. A victory that felt strangely incomplete. The retreat created relief. Then the relief faded. And underneath it was something else. Something I hadn't addressed. That's why emotional distance can become addictive. Not because it solves problems. Because it temporarily reduces emotional intensity. It's like stepping outside during a crowded party. The fresh air feels amazing. For a while. But eventually you realize the fresh air isn't where your life is happening. It's just where you're hiding from it. I think that's what many people misunderstand about men who withdraw after intimacy. The withdrawal isn't always proof they don't care. Sometimes it's proof they care and don't know what to do about it. Now, that doesn't excuse the behavior. Not at all. Understanding something isn't the same as justifying it. If somebody repeatedly pulls away every time things get real, that still creates pain. That still creates confusion. That still affects the other person. Intentions don't magically protect people from consequences. But if we're trying to understand what happens internally, the story is often more complicated than people assume. Because behind the retreat is usually a person having an argument with themselves. An exhausting argument. Stay. Leave. Reach out. Disappear. Open up. Protect yourself. Trust her. Protect yourself. Try again. Protect yourself. The same answer appearing over and over. Protect yourself. Even when protection is no longer protecting anything. Even when it's costing more than it's saving. I remember one night sitting alone after creating distance I thought I needed. The room was quiet. My phone was face down on the table. I kept looking at it anyway. Not touching it. Just looking. And eventually the truth arrived. The retreat wasn't making me feel better anymore. It was just making me feel less exposed. There was a difference. A huge difference. Feeling less exposed isn't the same as feeling happier. Feeling less vulnerable isn't the same as feeling fulfilled. Feeling safe isn't always the same as feeling alive. That realization stayed with me. Because it explained something I'd spent years misunderstanding. The problem wasn't intimacy. The problem was my reaction to intimacy. The problem wasn't connection. The problem was what connection activated inside me. The fears. The doubts. The uncertainty. The parts of myself I preferred not to confront. And once I understood that, something became painfully clear. Sometimes the person pulling away isn't escaping the relationship. They're escaping what the relationship reveals about them. And that's why her energy can feel even more dangerous after she withdraws. Because once she stops reaching, once she stops chasing, once she stops carrying the emotional weight of the connection, he no longer has intimacy to retreat from. He only has himself. And for some people, that's the moment when all the feelings they were avoiding finally catch up. There is a specific moment that changes everything. Not the moment she leaves. Not the moment she stops texting first. Not even the moment she pulls her energy back. Those things happen earlier. The moment that changes everything comes later. It's the moment he realizes he can no longer reach the version of her he once knew. And that's a different kind of loss. Because up until then, part of him still believes the connection is available. Maybe quieter. Maybe strained. Maybe complicated. But available. There is still a psychological safety net. The belief that if he really wanted to, he could reconnect. could reach out. She would respond. Things would become familiar again. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. That assumption lingers much longer than people realize. Sometimes for months, sometimes longer. Then one day something shifts. Not necessarily in reality, in perception. And suddenly he sees her differently. Not because she became someone else, because he no longer has access to her inner world. And human beings are surprisingly uncomfortable when access disappears. I remember experiencing this once. For a long time, even after distance entered the situation, I still felt connected to her in a strange way. Not actively connected, more like psychologically connected. I still knew her routines, still understood her personality, still felt like I could predict her reactions, still felt familiar with her. Then one afternoon something happened. Something incredibly small. I saw a photo. That's it. A photo. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. No new relationship. No obvious message. Just a photo. And for the first time, she felt like a separate person. Not my idea of her. Not my memory of her. Not the version stored inside my head. An actual separate human being living a life I knew nothing about. And for some reason, that hit harder than I expected. Because familiarity had quietly been replaced by uncertainty. The strange thing is that she hadn't changed overnight. I had simply lost access to information. Lost access to context. Lost access to her daily life. And once context disappears, the imagination takes over. Sometimes that's when people start saying things like, "She seems different." Maybe. Or maybe you just don't know her anymore. Those aren't the same thing. I think this is where many men begin experiencing a kind of emotional disorientation. Because for so long, she occupied a familiar psychological space. Even if the relationship itself was inconsistent, even if communication wasn't perfect, she still felt reachable, emotionally available, knowable. Then suddenly she doesn't. Now she feels unpredictable, independent, distant, not cold, just outside his emotional reach. And that shift can feel surprisingly powerful. I remember driving one evening and thinking about this. The traffic was terrible. I was barely moving. One of those slow crawls through the city where your mind starts wandering because your body has nothing else to do. And I caught myself wondering what she was doing. Then immediately realizing I had no idea. Not even a guess. That realization felt strange. Because there had been a time when I knew. Not because I monitored her. Not because I controlled anything. Because we shared our lives. Small details. Normal details. The kind of details people exchange when they're emotionally connected. Now those details were gone. And suddenly there was a gap. A blank space. And human beings hate blank spaces. We always want to fill them. With stories. With assumptions. With fantasies. With fears. Anything except uncertainty. I think that's part of why someone can seem more attractive after they pull back. Not because absence creates magic. Because uncertainty creates attention. The brain becomes fascinated by what it can't access. The same way a locked door becomes more interesting than an open one. Not because the door changed. Because access changed. And honestly, that's a difficult thing to admit. Because nobody wants to believe uncertainty affects them. Especially people who pride themselves on being rational. Independent. Logical. But uncertainty affects everybody. Even the people who claim it doesn't. Maybe especially them. I remember opening her profile once after not looking for weeks. And what surprised me wasn't what I saw. It was what I felt. Distance. Not hostility. Not sadness. Distance. The strange realization that her life had continued moving forward, whether I was participating in it or not. Which sounds obvious. Of course it had. That's how life works. But emotionally, some truths take longer to arrive. part of us quietly assumes the world pauses where we left it. That people remain psychologically available. That opportunities stay open. That connections remain suspended in time. Then reality reminds us otherwise. People keep growing, keep changing, keep adapting, especially when they stop waiting. I think that's one of the most misunderstood parts of emotional withdrawal. People assume she becomes more powerful because she's withdrawing. But most of the time, that's not what's happening. She's becoming more focused on herself, more invested in her own life, more engaged with her own future. And from the outside, that can look like power, especially to someone who still has one foot stuck in the past version of the connection. I remember a conversation with a friend years ago. He was describing someone he couldn't stop thinking about. And eventually he said something interesting. "I don't even know who she is anymore." At first I thought he was exaggerating. Then I realized exactly what he meant. He didn't mean her personality had changed. He meant his access had changed. The version of her inside his head was outdated. And that's a surprisingly painful thing to discover. Because once you realize your image of someone is outdated, you also realize something else. Life has been happening without you. Entire experiences, entire conversations, entire emotional developments, all occurring outside your awareness. And suddenly the person feels bigger, more complex, more mysterious. Not because they became mysterious, because your knowledge became incomplete. There's a difference, a huge difference. And that difference creates a strange emotional tension. Part of him still feels connected to who she was. Another part realizes he no longer knows who she is becoming. That gap can feel enormous, especially if he waited too long to notice it. I think that's why regret often arrives around this stage. Not dramatic regret, not movie scene regret. The quieter version, the kind that appears while doing ordinary things. Washing dishes, driving home, standing in line for coffee. You suddenly realize there are parts of her life you'll never know. Parts of her growth you'll never witness. Parts of her story that no longer include you. And that realization lands differently than heartbreak. Heartbreak is loud. This is quieter, heavier, more reflective. Because it forces a difficult question. When exactly did she become unreachable? And usually there isn't an answer. There isn't one moment, one event, one turning point. The distance accumulates gradually. Conversation by conversation. Missed opportunity by missed opportunity. Unspoken truth by unspoken truth. Until eventually familiarity becomes memory. And memory becomes imagination. And imagination becomes longing. I remember having an internal conversation about this one night. One of those conversations that only happens when the room is dark and your defenses are tired. Do you miss her? Yes. Or do you miss the version of her you remember? That question stayed with me. Because memory edits people. It softens edges, highlights certain moments, erases others, creates versions of people that no longer fully exist. Meanwhile, real life continues. The actual person keeps evolving. And eventually those two versions separate. The remembered version and the real version. The distance between them grows larger every day. That's why seeing her become unreachable feels so unsettling. Because it forces him to confront something he spent months avoiding. The connection wasn't frozen in time. Neither was she. While he was analyzing, avoiding, overthinking, needing more certainty, needing more space, life kept moving. She kept moving. And now there's a version of her he can no longer access through memory alone. A version that exists beyond his assumptions, beyond his expectations, beyond his control. And strangely enough, that's often the moment she starts feeling the most powerful. Not because she's trying to be, not because she's playing a role, not because she's become emotionally unavailable, but because for the first time, he is forced to see her as a complete person rather than a familiar emotional constant. A person with her own thoughts, her own growth, her own future. A future that may or may not include him. And that possibility, that deeply human, uncomfortable possibility, is what makes her feel different now. Not larger, not better, not more valuable, just real. And sometimes reality feels far more intimidating than fantasy ever did. I think some of the most important conversations in a person's life never actually happen. They never leave the mind, never leave the drafts folder, never leave the late-night silence where they were created. They exist only as possibilities, as rehearsals, as imagined futures, as words that almost became real. And if you've ever cared about someone at the wrong time, or cared about someone while fighting yourself, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Because there comes a point in this story where the memories aren't the loudest thing anymore. The uncertainty isn't the loudest thing anymore. The thing that starts making the most noise is the conversation that isn't happening. The message that isn't being sent. The phone call that isn't being made. The truth that keeps getting postponed. I remember lying in bed one night staring at my phone. Not touching it, just staring at it. Which, when you think about it, is a very modern kind of suffering. A glowing screen sitting 3 feet away, containing every possible outcome, and somehow feeling heavier than 100 pounds. Because reaching out sounds simple until emotions get involved. Then suddenly it becomes complicated. You start calculating, predicting, preparing for outcomes that haven't happened. You write messages in your head, delete them before they exist, argue with yourself, create entire conversations with imaginary versions of the other person. And the entire time, nothing is actually happening, except inside you. I remember opening a message thread once. Just opening it. Not typing. Not sending. Not doing anything. And immediately feeling anxious. Which felt ridiculous. How can opening a conversation make somebody anxious? Because it wasn't the conversation. It was what the conversation represented. Possibility. Rejection. Vulnerability. Hope. Regret. All squeezed into one tiny screen. That's why unsent conversations are so powerful. Because they contain every outcome simultaneously. The moment you send the message, reality takes over. Before you send it, imagination remains in control. And imagination can be strangely addictive. Especially when reality feels uncertain. I think that's why some people spend weeks thinking about reaching out. Months sometimes. Not because they don't know what they want to say. Because once they say it, they'll have to live with the answer. And answers remove fantasy. I remember typing, "Hey, I've been thinking about you." Then deleting it. Not because it wasn't true. Because it was. That was the problem. Truth makes things real. Real things require courage. And courage is much harder at midnight. Especially when you're alone. Especially when your pride is sitting beside you pretending to be wisdom. You know that voice. Everybody knows that voice. Don't text her. Why? Because. That's not an answer. You know what I mean? No, I don't. What if she doesn't care? What if she does? And there it is. The real question hiding underneath all the others. Not what if she rejects me? What if she doesn't? Because strangely enough, both possibilities are frightening. If she rejects you, it hurts. If she doesn't reject you, now something has to happen. Now vulnerability becomes necessary. Now action becomes necessary. Now honesty becomes necessary. And for someone who has spent months avoiding emotional clarity, that's terrifying. I remember going through a period where I convinced myself I was waiting for the right moment. That's a dangerous phrase. The right moment. Because sometimes it's wisdom. Sometimes timing genuinely matters. And sometimes it's just fear wearing a very sophisticated disguise. I kept telling myself, not tonight. Maybe tomorrow. I'll reach out when I know exactly what I want. I'll reach out when I understand everything. I'll reach out when I'm certain. The The problem was that certainty never arrived. Not completely. It never does. Life isn't built that way. Relationships aren't built that way. Human emotions certainly aren't built that way. And meanwhile, days kept passing. Then weeks. Then months. That's the hidden danger of unsent conversations. They create the illusion of movement. You think about the conversation constantly. You analyze it. Rehearse it. Refine it. You feel emotionally engaged. Productive even. But nothing is actually changing. The distance remains. The silence remains. The reality remains untouched. I remember driving home late one night after spending an entire evening thinking about sending a message. Not writing one. Thinking about writing one. Which is somehow even more exhausting. The roads were empty. The city felt quiet. And somewhere during that drive I had this uncomfortable realization. I wasn't struggling with communication. I was struggling with exposure. The message itself wasn't the problem. The possibility of being seen was the problem. Because reaching out requires honesty. And honesty removes hiding places. Once you say, "I miss you," you can no longer pretend you don't. Once you say, "I've been thinking about you," you can no longer hide behind distance. Once you say, "I was wrong," the version of yourself that needed to be right suddenly disappears. That's why so many conversations stay unsent. Not because people don't care. Because caring is precisely what makes it difficult. I think men especially struggle here sometimes. Not because they're incapable of vulnerability. Because many of them learn to associate vulnerability with loss of control. And unsent conversations are all about maintaining control. As long as the words remain inside your head, you control the narrative. You control the outcome. You control the fantasy. Reality can't disappoint you if reality never gets invited into the room. But reality can't reconnect you either. That's the trade. Safety in exchange for possibility. And eventually that trade becomes exhausting. I remember opening her profile one night, then closing it, then opening it again, then putting my phone down face first on the table. Like somehow turning the phone over would solve an emotional problem. Human beings do strange things when they're conflicted. We create rituals. Tiny avoidances. Tiny negotiations. Anything except making a decision. I sat there for a while, listening to the refrigerator hum. Listening to traffic outside. Listening to my own thoughts becoming louder. Then another internal conversation started. "Do you want to talk to her?" "Yes." "Then talk to her." It's not that simple. Why? Because I don't know what happens next. And that was it. The real answer. Not pride. Not strategy. Not timing. Fear of what comes after. Fear of the unknown. Fear of consequences. Fear of finding out whether the connection still exists. Or worse, finding out it doesn't. But here's what nobody tells you. Avoidance has consequences too. They just arrive slower. Much slower. That's why regret often shows up late. Regret isn't always about rejection. Sometimes it's about silence. Sometimes it's about realizing you spent 6 months protecting yourself from a pain that never actually arrived. Meanwhile, life kept moving. The other person kept moving. The opportunity kept moving. I remember imagining conversations that never happened. Entire conversations. Detailed conversations. The way she might respond. The things I might say. The explanations. The apologies. The awkward laughter. The uncomfortable honesty. And the strange thing is that those imagined conversations started feeling real. Familiar. Comfortable. Almost safer than actual communication. Because imagination never surprises you. Real people do. Real people say unexpected things. Real people have changed while you've been overthinking. Real people don't follow your script. That's why reality feels dangerous. And that's why people stay trapped inside unsent conversations. The fantasy becomes easier than the risk. But eventually something starts bothering him. Something deeper than uncertainty. A realization. A painful realization. He's no longer waiting for the right words. He's waiting for courage. And those are not the same thing. The words have been there for months. The truth has been there for months. The feelings have been there for months. The only thing missing is the willingness to expose them. And that's where the internal conflict reaches its peak. Because now he knows. He knows what he feels. He knows what he wants to say. He knows why he's hesitating. And somehow, he still does nothing. Which is one of the most human experiences imaginable. People love stories where awareness immediately creates action. Real life isn't like that. Sometimes awareness arrives first. Action arrives much later. Sometimes awareness arrives and action never comes. Sometimes people understand themselves perfectly and still remain frozen. Not because they're stupid. Not because they're weak. Because they're human. And human beings can spend an astonishing amount of time standing between a feeling and a decision. So the unsent conversations continue. The messages written and deleted. The late-night arguments. The imagined futures. The rehearsed honesty. The private confessions that never reach the person they were meant for. And somewhere inside all of that silence, a deeper question begins forming. A question he can no longer avoid. Not, what should I say? Not, what will she think? Not even, does she still care? The question becomes much simpler. Much more uncomfortable. How much longer are you willing to let fear make decisions for you? And once that question arrives, the silence starts feeling heavier than the risk ever did. I think by this point we've probably arrived at the wrong conclusion several times. At least I did. First I thought the problem was her absence. Then I thought the problem was missing her. Then I thought the problem was uncertainty. Then regret. Then loneliness. Then fear. Then timing. Then vulnerability. And the strange thing is that all of those explanations contain some truth. Just not the whole truth. Because when I look back now, the thing that actually felt dangerous wasn't any of those things by themselves. It was self-confrontation. It was being forced to sit in a room with myself after all the distractions stopped working. No messages. No certainty. No emotional safety net. No convenient explanations. Just me. And that was much harder than I expected. Because most people think they know themselves. Until a relationship exposes something. Until somebody matters. Until somebody pulls away. And suddenly you discover entire parts of yourself you've never really examined. I remember one particular night. Nothing special happened. No life-changing event. No dramatic realization. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels different after midnight. The television was off. The apartment was dark. The city outside had mostly gone quiet. And there was nothing left to distract me. No work. No conversations. No obligations. Just thoughts. And that's when something uncomfortable started happening. The story I'd been telling myself began falling apart. You know the story. Everybody has one. The version of events that makes us feel slightly better. Slightly more justified. Slightly less responsible. Mine sounded something like this. The timing wasn't right. I needed space. I was confused. I had a lot going on. And maybe some of those things were true. Probably all of them were true to some degree. But there was another truth sitting underneath them. A truth I had spent months avoiding. I cared. More than I admitted. More than I wanted to admit. More than fit comfortably into the story I preferred. And once that realization arrived, everything else started rearranging itself around it. Because now I wasn't asking, why did she pull away? I was asking, why did I wait so long to be honest with myself? That's a much harder question. A much less satisfying question. Because it doesn't allow for blame. It doesn't allow for easy villains. It forces you to look inward. And looking inward is uncomfortable, especially when you don't like everything you find. I think that's why so many people stay focused on the other person. It's easier. It's easier to analyze her behavior, her choices, her distance, her silence, her actions, than it is to sit with your own. I know because I did exactly that. For months, maybe longer, I kept trying to understand her. Meanwhile, the person I was least curious about was myself. And that's ironic, because most of the answers were sitting there the entire time, hidden inside my own behavior, my own contradictions, my own delays, my own fears. I remember having one of those internal conversations that felt annoyingly honest. The kind you can't escape once it starts. Do you miss her? Yes. Do you regret things? Yes. Then why didn't you do something sooner? Because I was scared. Scared of what? Everything. The answer felt embarrassingly simple. Not sophisticated. Not profound. Just human. Fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of making the wrong decision. Fear of needing someone. Fear of losing someone. Fear of being seen. Fear of failing. Fear of succeeding. Sometimes people talk about fear as though it's one thing. It's not. It's a crowd. A whole room full of voices talking at the same time. And if you're not careful, you start mistaking those voices for wisdom. You start calling fear logic. You start calling fear timing. You start calling fear being realistic. Meanwhile, it's just fear, sitting quietly in the driver's seat. I think that's what her withdrawal exposed more than anything. Not my feelings for her. My relationship with myself. The ways I avoided discomfort. The ways I postponed decisions. The ways I waited for certainty that never came. The ways I convinced myself I had more time than I actually did. Because that's another uncomfortable truth. Most people live as though emotional opportunities are permanent. As though meaningful conversations can happen later. As though honesty can happen later. As though vulnerability can happen later. And sometimes later arrives. Sometimes it doesn't. That's what makes life difficult. Nobody tells you which opportunities are temporary while you're living them. You find out afterward. I remember standing in a grocery store one afternoon, buying completely ordinary things. Coffee, bread, some random things I can't even remember now. And suddenly I had this strange realization. Life had continued. That's it. Life had continued. Months had passed. People had changed, including me. The world hadn't stopped. The story hadn't frozen. And for a moment I felt both sadness and relief at the same time, which is a strange emotional combination. But real emotions are strange. Part of me felt sad because some things were gone. Part of me felt relieved because I was finally seeing them clearly. The fantasy was fading. The excuses were fading. The denial was fading. And underneath all of it was reality. Not dramatic reality. Not movie reality. Ordinary reality. The reality that two people can care about each other and still get things wrong. The reality that awareness doesn't always arrive on time. The reality that good intentions don't automatically become good actions. The reality that feelings and behavior are not the same thing. I think that's one of the hardest lessons in all of this. Feelings don't automatically create action. People assume they do. If he cared, he would have. If she loved him, she would have. Maybe. Maybe not. Human beings are messy. People know things and still avoid them. People feel things and still run from them. People understand themselves and still repeat old patterns. Awareness is important, but awareness isn't courage. Those are two different things. And I learned that later than I wish I had. There were moments when I knew exactly what I felt. Exactly. Crystal clear. And I still did nothing. Because understanding isn't the final step. Action is. And action requires risk. That's why some people change after these experiences. and some people don't. Not because one group is better. Because change demands something. It demands the willingness to feel uncomfortable. The willingness to be wrong. The willingness to be vulnerable. The willingness to stop hiding behind explanations. Some people reach that point. Some don't. That's just reality. I wish every story ended with perfect growth. Perfect honesty. Perfect reconciliation. But real life isn't structured that way. Sometimes he reaches out. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes she responds. Sometimes she doesn't. Sometimes people reconnect. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they learn the lesson. Sometimes they repeat it with somebody new. Human beings are complicated. More complicated than internet advice likes to admit. And maybe that's why this entire experience feels so unsettling. Not because her energy became more powerful. Not because she became mysterious. Not because she transformed into someone unreachable. The thing that actually felt dangerous was much closer than that. It was the mirror. That's what her withdrawal became. A mirror. A mirror showing him his assumptions. His fears. His delays. His contradictions. His emotional habits. His avoidance. His longing. His humanity. And mirrors are uncomfortable because they don't argue. They don't chase. They don't persuade. They simply reflect. I think that's why some men spend months thinking they're trying to understand her, when in reality they're slowly being forced to understand themselves. Not the version of themselves they'd like to be. The real version. The one who cared and pretended not to. The one who wanted closeness and feared it simultaneously. The one who kept waiting for certainty. The one who kept saying later. The one who believed there would always be more time. And maybe that's the final truth hiding underneath this entire story. Her energy never became dangerous because she pulled back. Her energy felt dangerous because when she pulled back, all the places he used to hide disappeared with her. The reassurance disappeared. The distractions disappeared. The familiar patterns disappeared. And for the first time, there was nowhere left to run. Only himself. Only the truth. Only the quiet realization that some of the hardest emotions in life are not created by losing someone. They're created by finally seeing yourself clearly. And whether he acts on that realization or not, whether he changes or not, whether he reaches out or remains silent, that part remains unresolved. Because real life is unresolved. People are unresolved. Love is unresolved. Growth is unresolved. The story doesn't end with certainty. It ends the way most honest stories do. With awareness. A little regret. A little compassion. A little discomfort. And a question still hanging in the air long after the conversation is over. What would have happened if he had stopped running sooner? This closes the script with reflection rather than a motivational ending, keeping the tone emotionally human, imperfect, and unresolved, the way real experiences usually feel when we look back on them.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.